Fáilte. Welcome to today's talk, Brexit and the Prótacal by Michael Dougan and chaired by Allison Morris. This event is part of this year's special online virtual Féile, brought to you by Féile and Phobail in partnership with St Mary's University College and the Irish News. Michael Dougan, who some of you will know from previous years, is Professor of European Law and Jean Monnet Chair in EU Law at the University of Liverpool. His work has contributed to wider public and political debates about European law. And Allison Morris is the crime correspondent and columnist at the Belfast Telegraph. So, Allison, I'll pass over to you.
I'm indeed, and also a very proud West Belfast woman. So delighted to be here at Féile and Phobail. As Joanna has just said, Michael, you're a lecturer in European law, which I know that your work was widely recognised in academic circles. But then you woke up one morning, didn't you, in June 2016 and realised that all of a sudden you had an expertise that was of great value to people like myself who were trying to come to grips with what on earth had just happened. So if you take us back, let's just go back and like, we don't want to do a complete autopsy on the past 5 years, but let's go back to that referendum vote. Did you think at the time that the UK were going to vote to leave the EU, or like the majority of people, did you think this was a vanity exercise by David Cameron that wasn't going anywhere?
Well, I think it was a bit of both, really, wasn't it? It was definitely a bit of a vanity exercise by David Cameron, but I mean, I know a lot of people were very surprised at the result of the referendum. I think those of us who were sort of a bit more familiar with the UK debate and the sort of state of UK politics, specifically on EU membership over a period of years, weren't surprised at all. We knew it was going to be 52-48, one way or the other. And it was really going to be one way or the other. It was always going to be a very, very close call indeed. So I wasn't particularly surprised at the outcome of the referendum. Extremely disappointed, of course, but I wasn't particularly surprised. But of course, it was partly a vanity exercise by David Cameron, who very foolishly believed that he could actually sit the demands of the hard right of the Conservative Party, and really he should have learned the lesson that previous Tory leaders had learned, that you cannot sit extremists. You know, they'll always want more, and they'll never be satisfied with any sort of compromise. But also, he thought that he was the great leader who, you know, having built a career out of pretending to be this enormous Eurosceptic, could suddenly convert the masses to Europhilia at the drop of a hat. A very, very silly, arrogant man. So a bit of both.
Yeah, and then he legged it, didn't he? And left everybody else to deal with that.
I'm sure he's rolling in the cash in some other way.
Yeah, I mean, in the build-up to that referendum on this island, both north and south, there was constant discussion about the Good Friday Agreement, about the border and what was going to happen. That discussion was not happening in Great Britain and in parts of the United Kingdom. And I listened into many debates in relation to that. And with hindsight, when we went back over and looked over a lot of the literature and a lot of the material that went on both sides, on both Leave and Remain, there was very little talk about our border. It was almost as if when that referendum result came in, that somebody in Westminster went, has anyone considered what we're going to do with 300 odd miles of a land border in Ireland? And that, I suppose, is when those years, when myself as a journalist, when we became consumed with Brexit and what was going to happen to our border, as someone who obviously was an expert in that type of law, you could have, I'm sure, foreseen that. Were you frustrated or surprised by any of the debate and the fact that there was so little preparation or consideration given to what was going to happen on this island as they ended up doing, if the UK had voted to leave the EU?
Sure, it's a really good question. I mean, from the point of view of, you know, anyone who was vaguely aware of EU membership, the implications of Brexit for Ireland, North and South, it was very obvious that the Irish border was going to become one of the most difficult problems that Brexit would create, and one of the most difficult situations that had to be handled. That was so obvious that it really does shock us that anyone didn't see it coming. But of course, I spent a lot of my time in the run-up to the referendum doing public events, public talks, question and answer sessions and debates. And I think it's fair to say that the level of interest in England, anyway, about the impact of UK withdrawal upon Ireland, north or south, was virtually non-existent. Of course, there are always some very well-meaning people who show an active interest in other people's lives, but by and large, it was completely of no interest insofar as it came up at all. And this is actually quite entertaining in a weird way. I was always surprised, first of all, by the number of people who didn't seem to know that Northern Ireland was technically part of the UK. Even more surprised by the number of people who seemed to be unaware that the Republic is actually an independent country and not part of the UK. But also just sort of very, very depressed by the comments, which basically said, you're making this up. You're just making up problems to try and scare people out of vote and leave. And, this isn't a real problem. And the Northern Irish border isn't going to cause any difficulties. It's all Project Fear. And of course, we've all been proven completely correct that the Northern Irish border is one of the main casualties of Brexit, and with it, potentially the whole peace process as well.
Yeah, and those who raised concerns about the border, as you said, were told that we were just trying to prevent Brexit or delay Brexit, or we just tried to explain. Then, much like yourself, I found that there was an interest in people from this part of the world speaking, on mainstream English radio shows to discuss the problems. Obviously, I'm a security journalism, but you felt like you were saying the words, but nobody was actually quite listening as to what the true implications of that were going to be. Explain just for anyone listening to this, we had the Theresa May period, when there was a lot of different kind of pushes to try and find a solution to the problem, the backstop being the one that was rejected by the DUP, who at that stage, obviously, we know held a sway of power in Westminster. What difference would that have made to the problems that we have now, had Theresa May managed to get her deal through, and had we been working on that system instead of the system we're currently working on?
Okay, that's a really good question, and I'm just going to jot down a couple of little notes before I forget. In some respects, Theresa May's backstop would have made life a lot easier than it is at the moment. In particular, because on the customs side of things, Theresa May basically proposed that the whole of the UK would stay ineffectively in a customs union with the EU. And so a lot of the questions about customs checks, about customs duties, about which goods are at risk of entering the EU market when they enter Northern Ireland, and what customs duties do they pay, and a lot of those problems would have disappeared because the whole of the UK would have stayed aligned to the whole of the EU's customs regime. On the other hand, it's not that Theresa May's backstop would have completely removed the problems for two reasons, I think. First of all, because Theresa May still proposed that Northern Ireland, but not Great Britain, would stay in regulatory alignment with the EU on various regulatory issues to do with the manufacture and the marketing of goods. So there would still have been some degree of regulatory difference between the Northern Ireland and Great Britain, which could have led to a degree of trade barriers. So there was the question of sort of regulatory alignment outside the field of customs. But also quite important is the fact that Theresa May's backstop was very consciously intended to be only a temporary measure, and it was intended to be replaced with something sort of as soon as possible. So there was still going to be a degree of inbuilt instability in the Theresa May settlement. I think maybe the more important than the sort of technical legal stuff about the difference between the May approach and the Boris Johnson approach is that I think at least Theresa May, for all her faults, and they were many, and I'm not going to martyrize and canonize Theresa May in hindsight, even though it's tempting to do so by comparison with Boris Johnson, I think she did have a degree of political and moral integrity, not much, but degree. And I think she genuinely understood the nature of the problems that Brexit could cause for Ireland, and genuinely wanted to find workable solutions to them. Whereas that is simply not the case, I think, with Boris Johnson. So I think in a way, that's probably the more important difference than the legal technicalities, is actually the political philosophy of those respective prime ministers. I think Theresa May genuinely wanted to find a solution that would work for Ireland, whereas Boris Johnson, I think, couldn't care less.
I always got the impression that Theresa May was a unionist to her backbone and wanted to preserve the union, and that the DUP would have been much better throwing all their eggs into her basket, whereas Boris Johnson is more of an English nationalist, and that was his motivation. And it really was a case of, if I lived to be 150, I will never understand why the DUP manoeuvred a woman who had their best interests at heart out of the way to put a man who only has his own self-interest at heart in place. And that is something that I think that will baffle us all till the end of time. And the DUP themselves possibly might think that now with hindsight. I'm not sure they thought it at the time. After what happened there, and we know the history of it, Boris Johnson gets a massive majority. The DUP no longer hold the sway of power. And then what do you believe happened to change that? Do you think that the ERG had more of an influence on Boris Johnson? Do you think it was just a case of he intended to deliver Brexit regardless of the damage or the collateral damage that was done in the wake of that? And why then as well did the EU seem more, I think, more pliable when dealing with Boris Johnson than they were in dealing with Theresa May, who I think, at sometimes they were reluctant to try and compromise with her, but all of a sudden we've seen Boris Johnson, getting his back slapped and all, the jolly boys together when he met with the other 27 member states, and that seemed a very different approach than Theresa May had. So, I mean, when you were analysing this and looking back, what do you think was the sequence of events that led the EU to agree to that deal with Boris Johnson when they seemed stuck on not negotiating any further with Theresa May?
Sure. I think it's a fairly simple equation that then becomes complicated by details. But if we just focus on the simple equation, the answers are actually fairly clear. There were two big sticking points in the whole Brexit negotiations that were totally intertwined with each other. And the first one was, what sort of relationship does the UK want to have with the EU into the future? Does it want to have a fairly close relationship where it remains fairly closely aligned to the single market, the customs union? You minimize economic disruption. You also help address issues about movement of goods and services and so on. But it comes at a cost. The cost is that the UK basically has to follow the EU's rules. While no longer a member state, it's given up its vote, it's given up its influence, but it's still bound by the EU rules. Or does the UK want to have a hard break from the EU? Does it want to go its own way? Does it want to diverge from EU norms? In which case, of course, there's greater economic disruption, greater disruption to goods and services and trade and so on. So that was the basic choice facing the UK about its future relationship with the EU. Now, the problem is, of course, that the border of Northern Ireland really is deeply affected by those choices. If the UK opts for a close relationship with the EU, the border problem in Northern Ireland is greatly reduced. If the UK opts for a distant relationship with the EU, the border problem for Northern Ireland is greatly increased. Now, Theresa May basically made the choice, roughly, that she'd rather solve the border problem in Northern Ireland, even if it meant that the UK remained more closely tied to the EU than the far-right Tories would really have liked. And Theresa May did make that choice. She made it in quite a confused way. It took her quite a while to get there, and there was a lot of mixed messages, but she made that choice. We'd rather stay more closely aligned with the EU as a whole, and that helps solve the Northern Irish border problem, at least in large part. The big change which happened with Boris Johnson is that Boris Johnson simply made the opposite calculation. He got elected as leader of the Tory party on the back of the support of the ERG, and stupidly, of course, with the tacit support of the DUP, basically saying, I'm going to deliver the hard Brexit, the clean break, and I'm going to do it quickly, and I'm going to do it as soon as I possibly can. But of course, that necessarily meant dumping Northern Ireland in the hot water and simply stabbing the UK in the back. As you say, Boris Johnson is sufficiently narcissistic and a sufficient English nationalist that meant nothing to him, of course. But effectively, that's the big change which happened between Theresa May and Boris Johnson. He simply decided that in the equation, UK relationship with the EU, problems for Ireland, he couldn't care less about Ireland. He wanted the clean break, hard Brexit as soon as possible. And that's really the big change that happened. As for the sort of backslapping and camaraderie, I mean, I think we're all grown up enough to know that diplomacy requires a certain type of behaviour among EU leaders. They all slap each other in the back and they all pat
I'm going with the patriarchy. I'm going with the patriarchy. That is my explanation for it.
And we know that behind the scenes it's not necessarily like that, but that's public diplomacy for us. I think it's probably fair to say that Boris Johnson is probably considered a fairly dirty word in most European capitals.
Could you explain, I mean, as far as I can see, maybe you can give me that there's a fourth solution. There was 3 possible solutions to the problem that Ireland possessed for Britain to do what they wanted to do. So you could have a border in the sea, and you could have the checks at the Irish Sea. You could have some kind of land border and checks at the border between North and South. Or you could have no checks at all and some sort of mutual equivalence, standards that, and I think that's what the DUP are saying should be in place now, instead of the protocol where we just all, there's a trust element and there's just mutual equivalence on goods. So could you explain to people less, equipped in EU law than yourself, me included, the difference between those 3 and why the sea border then turned out to be the one that was the easiest to manage, I think, for Boris Johnson?
Okay, sure. There were actually sort of 3 realistic options and 1 unrealistic option.
Yep.
So I'll just add in
another realistic one.
Another realistic one. The realistic one was also for the whole of the UK, of course, to stay aligned with the EU. So there was no need for any border because there just simply wouldn't need to be one. But let's set that aside, because we know that Boris Johnson simply didn't want that at all. I mean, obviously, what we've ended up with is the sea border rather than the land border. And that's basically the only 2 realistic choices. As soon as Boris Johnson decided that it was hard Brexit time, there had to be a border between the EU and the UK. And that meant there had to be a border somewhere between Ireland, Northern Ireland, Great Britain. And the only choice was, is it a land border, which for all sorts of logistical reasons would have been virtually impossible to enforce, and also, of course, very deeply politically and socially and economically destabilizing? Or should there be a sea border, which is logistically a lot easier to enforce, but of course also comes with its own different set of challenges politically and economically as well? So that was the only realistic choice. Is it a land border or a sea border, once Boris Johnson had made his hard Brexit decision? As for the DUP stroke Tory fantasy that, but why can't the whole world just live in peace and harmony and we all just trust each other? And well, if only the world was like that, but we all know it bloody isn't. That's just not how the world works. We have borders because we have jurisdictional territories within which we have authorities that on behalf of their citizens set public standards for health, for security, for the protection of consumers, for the environment, to suppress crime, to maintain welfare. That's what territory. These are people who are obsessed with the nation state and obsessed with borders, and yet their understanding of borders is so poor, it's almost laughable. We have borders for plenty of good reasons, and those borders have to be enforced, because what you're basically doing is saying we are setting rules and standards to protect our citizens, to reflect our values, and we need to enforce those and police them to things which enter our territory, which enter our border. Now, the reason an organization like the EU can have a principle of mutual recognition, where we can have different rules, but we basically recognize each other as being more or less the same, is because it's surrounded by this great big infrastructure of institutions and processes and standards and checks and enforcement to make sure that we're all playing by roughly the same standards and respecting roughly the same principles. And we're all subject to the same types of court proceedings if things go wrong. We have processes of negotiation to help put things right and to solve problems. It's called the ecosystem, the ecosystem of the EU. You don't have mutual recognition just in the abstract or for the sake of it. You have mutual recognition because you spent 60 years building up a set of trust in institutions and processes that actually allow the member states of the EU to say, we trust you. We trust that if your French wine is good enough to drink in France, we can drink it in Ireland too, even though we haven't controlled it. We didn't set its manufacturing standards. We didn't determine the environmental rules, but we trust you because you're also a member state of the EU. What the DUP and the UK Tories are arguing for is to have all of the trust with none of the rules and none of the obligations. They don't want to be part of the institutions. They don't want to have to respect the minimum welfare standards. They don't want to have to respect the minimum environmental rules. They don't want to be subject to the same dispute settlement system. They don't want to be subject to the same state aid regime, but they still want all of the mutual trust. And that's simply not how the world works. If the world worked like that, then we wouldn't have borders. We just wouldn't have any borders at all, because we'd all trust each other and we'd all say, yes, let your goods, let your services, let your people come here freely. And effectively, this is just an extension of the cake and eat it philosophy, which has dogged the whole question of Brexit from the outset. They want to have all of the privileges, all of the freedoms, but they're not willing to accept the corresponding responsibilities and the corresponding duties.
How much of a role do you think that America, and that Irish America specifically, and that's very powerful lobby in America, and we remember, that Nancy Pelosi saying if there was anything that damaged the Good Friday Agreement, there would be no trade agreement. How much of a role do you think that had in shaping the British government's move completely away from considering the land border solution, or to be any kind of technology on the border to the sea border? Or do you think that was purely driven by, ERG and the kind of Brexit that Boris Johnson wanted?
Okay, I'm going to speculate a little scenario here, which is cynical, but certainly not implausible. In fact, there's a growing evidence to suggest that it's the most likely explanation, however cynical that might be. Let's say that we know when Theresa May was ousted by Boris Johnson, and Boris Johnson's calculation was, we're going for a hard Brexit and we're simply going to dump Northern Ireland and the DUP, there'll be a sea border. I'm quite convinced now that Boris Johnson did that not really intending to respect his word. He wanted to get Brexit done, and then he would worry about the border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, Ireland and Northern Ireland. And he basically was happy to sign up to any solution which would allow him to say that he had got Brexit done, thinking that he would revisit the whole situation at a later date. As part of that equation, I'm quite sure that Johnson and the right-wing Tories were hoping for a Trump election victory in America, because with a fellow populist lying toe-rag in power, it would make their life a lot easier to say, well, we don't care about international treaties, and we don't mind ripping up international agreements, and we don't mind going back on our word and behaving in a completely dishonorable way, because the White House does exactly the same, and we have our fellow populist toe-rag in power in the White House. I'm quite sure that Biden's election victory in the UK was the biggest upset to the calculations of the right-wing Tories when it came to Northern Ireland. Because suddenly, instead of having a fellow populist toe-rag in the White House who would back them up with all of their dishonorable behavior, they actually had an Irish American very committed to the international order, wanting to rebuild the idea of America as some sort of moral and political authority in the world, wanting to re-engage with America's traditional European allies, horrified, of course, at the type of regime that Boris Johnson runs with its right-wing populism and its post-truth ethos and so on. And so I'm quite sure that Biden's election victory was a major upset in the Tory calculations. And I think it's no coincidence. Remember at the time of the American election, the UK was trying to pass the UK government was trying to pass its internal market bill through Parliament, and the internal market bill contained the provisions which simply overrode the protocol. They simply allowed the UK government to ignore large parts of the protocol. I think it's no coincidence that those provisions were withdrawn after the Biden election victory in America, and I'm quite sure that played an important role in convincing the UK government that this full frontal assault on the very principle that if you sign a treaty, you should actually respect it, was one that they should probably not disregard too quickly and too abruptly.
It's interesting that we could be in a completely different place had Trump managed, well, a much more dangerous place, obviously globally, but in a different place regards to Brexit, had Trump managed to win that election, or even convince people he had won the election, as he tried for quite some time, quite some time after it. In terms of unionist objections to the protocol, I know we've heard lots about, sausage wars and saol on tractors and all sorts of other things. We know that that people who are involved in retail and trade and haulage have real concerns about the protocol and the red tape and everything that does in regards to their ability to conduct their business. But for unionism, we know that the real objection to the protocol is more one that those checks that take place, those east-west checks, to them feel like an assault on their sovereignty. In terms of the legal aspect of that, can you understand that position, or is that something that's purely a perception and has no basis in law?
It's quite. I found myself in quite a tricky position when I try and empathise with the unionist position, because on the one hand, there is a little bit of justification to some of the unionist concerns about this protocol. There is a degree of economic disruption. We know that. We know that there's more paperwork. We know that there are more processes. We know that there are restrictions. We know that supply chains have to be adapted. The problem is, of course, is that first of all, that was inevitable. that was always going to be the consequence of Brexit. And it was always going to be the consequence of the type of Brexit that, to be frank, the DUP long supported and that the British government finally agreed upon. So in a way, yes, there are problems to do with the protocol, but those problems were completely foreseeable. People like me and many of my colleagues, from the moment that Johnson's proposals were made public, said this will have the effect of segregating Northern Ireland economically from Great Britain. That will be its inevitable and direct consequence. We also said quite clearly, this will have potential political ramifications for the political identity of unionism. Because of course, although we might sort of, sneer a bit and say, oh, the sausage wars, just buy your sausages from somewhere else. Of course, it's not really about the sausages. Of course, we understand that there are identity politics at work here, and things which threaten the sort of unionist sense of belonging as full members of the UK are sensitive. We understand that. I think the problem for unionism really isn't the idea that, there are differences now. Northern Ireland is in a different place, thanks to Boris Johnson, than it would have been otherwise, and thanks to Brexit. The problem is that this is a situation which was proposed by the UK government, signed by the UK government, approved by the UK Parliament on behalf of the UK as a whole. Now, you're either a unionist or you're not. If you believe in the sovereignty of the UK, if you believe in the supremacy of the UK Parliament, then you basically got to accept the UK Parliament doesn't actually care very much about you in return. You value your union more than the UK institutions do, because it was the UK's own institutions that did this to you. And I think one of the big challenges for unionism is basically to accept that it's a bit of a one-way relationship, this love of the union, that actually it means a lot more to unionists than it does to English nationalists and so on, who actually dominate UK politics at the moment. So on the one hand, yes, I understand the concerns of unionism, and we foresaw them, and we all said this will be the consequence of this protocol. On the other hand, I think the challenge here is not to say, well, the protocol needs to be ripped up, the protocol needs to, the EU needs to become more flexible. Sorry, actually, the burden is on unionism to accept that Brexit changed everything. Those unionists who supported it should give themselves a bloody good kicking, and those unionists who didn't should really be thinking about whether a party like the DUP deserves any allegiance or support at all. But ultimately, the choices which Northern Ireland has now had to live with were choices made in London by the UK institutions. And that is the expression of UK sovereignty that unionism had sought to support for a very long time.
And did that court case that was taken, the Jim Allister one in relation to Brexit, I mean, the ruling on that, is the judgment on that was so complicated that only complete and utter EU nerds are ever going to read every single word of it. But I'm going to assume that you've read most of it. I read the summary. That's what I'm going to admit to. But given that the judge had, in that case, had agreed that the repeal of the Act of the Union had altered the sort of substance of the constitutional status of it, but Parliament was sovereign, so the decision was fine. That overruled it. Does it then have any implication? I hope I've explained that right. Implication on the sovereignty of Northern Ireland? Are unionists then right to consider that what has happened is going to have an impact in the future on their relationship with with the union?
It's a really good question about the court case, and the judgment is fairly long, but actually the judgment is pretty simple. Effectively, what the judge
simple
says.
For you, Michael.
But effectively, what the judge said was what basically any first-year undergraduate law student would learn almost in their first couple of weeks of their law degree. If Parliament says something, that's the law. And effectively, what the judge said was, Parliament has said this is how Brexit is going to work, and it's legislated to create these arrangements for Northern Ireland in order to deliver the Brexit that Boris Johnson promised in the general election. But Parliament did this. That's basic UK constitutional law. Now, the incidental effect of that, of course, is to say that the relationship between Northern Ireland and Great Britain in trade terms is different from what it was the day before that legislation was adopted. Now, does that mean that Northern Ireland is no longer part of the UK? No. Does it mean that Northern Ireland has been annexed by the EU as a hostile territory? No, of course it doesn't. That is so stupid as to be almost beyond belief that people actually say things like that out loud rather than think them and then describe themselves as idiots and tell themselves to shut up. This is hyperbole of the most dangerous kind. It's whipping up emotion, it's whipping up fear. The fact is that the trade relationship between Northern Ireland and Great Britain has changed. But let's be frank, after the UK Internal Market Act, which was passed, around the same time, came into effect around the same time as the transition period ended for Northern Ireland and for the UK as a whole, the trade relationship between England and Scotland also changed. The trade relationship between Wales and England changed. The trade relationship between Wales and Scotland changed. And the trade relationship between Northern Ireland and England, Scotland and Wales also changed. That entire network of relationships that makes up the UK market changed as a result of Brexit and because of the legislation that was adopted by the Westminster Parliament. So for unionists to say, you can't change our trading relationship with England, well, I haven't heard them objecting about the rules for Scotland, about the rules for Wales, about the rules for England itself. This was one of the changes which occurred as a result of Brexit, but it doesn't change the fact that Northern Ireland is a part of the UK as a sovereign state, and it has certainly not been annexed by anybody.
So I'm interested in exploring that because we are very consumed by what goes on in this island. This is where we live, and so the impact of Brexit, the impact of the protocol, the impact on trade, that is all something that we discuss widely and daily. But we see obviously there's slight detachment, but we know that a similar conversation is going on in Scotland, and Brexit is obviously being used by the SNP as their latest, push to have a second unity referendum in relation to that. It seems to me that as a result of Brexit and as a result of that vote, we are seeing, the union at its weakest that it has ever been, and that there's a fair chance that Scotland may actually go long before we ever get a border poll on this in this part of the world. And once they go, it's very hard to see how you can keep the rest of the union together. There's even talk of now having, a devolved parliament in the north of England, where they obviously think that the pandemic showed that there was very little concern for what went on outside of London in relation to the Westminster government. I mean, as someone who, you specialise in this area of law, this area of academia, do you think that in 10 years' time you will be on a similar, discussion discussing how Brexit eventually led to the breakup of the union? Do you think that Scotland is likely to use that? Obviously, they wanted to remain in the EU. They've made it quite clear they wanted to remain in the EU. Is that the direction of travel you think that we're going in?
It's a tricky question to ask, obviously, because there's a lot of speculation, and I should probably point out that I'm not primarily a UK lawyer, and in fact, I've sort of got to decide for myself at some stage or another that I'm simply not interested in third countries like the UK. I'm interested in the EU and its member states. And of course, I have a particular interest in the situation in Ireland because it's my home and it's my state of nationality, and I'm from Belfast. And of course, I care very deeply about Northern Ireland. But on the Scotland question, there are some really interesting things which
they want to rejoin the EU. They've made that quite clear in the event of an independence referendum. And that will be the one difference in this independence referendum than the last one. This will be a referendum where you'll be saying independence, but also on rejoining the European Union.
Absolutely. And there are a couple of things to throw into the equation with Scotland. On the sort of push factor, sort of for leaving the UK, it's not just Brexit, because obviously Scotland voted very strongly to remain. There's been a very, I think the statistics suggest that the support for EU membership grew after the referendum. And obviously that's been a real source of tension, the relationship between the Scottish government and the government in London, but also the view of the Scottish population as well. But it's not just Brexit. I mentioned before the UK Internal Market Act, and the idea that Westminster basically rewrote the rules about how Scotland and England interact with each other, or Wales and England interact with each other, just as much as they rewrote the rules for Northern Ireland. And one of the effects of that UK internal market legislation is to have a significant impact upon the devolved institutions in Scotland. If in effect, there are significant areas now of policy making in Scotland where the Scots can try and regulate things for themselves, but in effect, English goods and services can flood into Scotland, and there is nothing the Scots can do about it, because there is a very strong principle of mutual recognition which has been imposed upon Scotland against the will of the devolved institutions that effectively create a totally imbalanced market between England and Scotland and really hobble the power of the devolved institutions. So it's not just Brexit, it's actually, again, the knock-on consequences of Brexit, different to Northern Ireland, but similar in spirit, where Westminster was basically saying, you may call it a union, we call it English domination over the rest of the country. So I think there are strong push factors in terms of Scottish independence. From my perspective as an EU lawyer, the interesting question, of course, arises if Scotland does decide to become independent in terms of its accession to the EU, because then there will be interesting questions for Scotland about its EU membership. Does Scotland want to join the single currency? Does Scotland have, the inclination to say we want to sign up to the euro, we want to become a full part of the single currency, and what's the timescale for doing that? Probably more important and more relevant as well for Ireland is, does Scotland want to try and maintain the common travel area with England and Ireland, north and south, or does Scotland want to become a part of the Schengen zone and effectively create its own hard border, if you like, with England? And that raises all sorts of interesting questions then also for Ireland, because there has to come a point, I suppose, when Ireland has to ask the question, what is this common travel area for? And where is it leading us to? And what's the situation with Northern Ireland, of course, but also what's the situation with Scotland? So I think there are all sorts of interesting questions that will arise from Scottish independence. But obviously that's the stuff that the lawyers will get their teeth into as and when the questions arise.
And I suppose our relationship here, especially in the north of Ireland, and unionism's relationship is much closer to Scotland historically than it ever would be to England. And I think, recently I've heard so many unionists discussing the previous, what they see as betrayals, be that the Anglo-Irish Agreement, be that the Brexit Protocol. So it's an interesting dynamic it creates for them, because who do they want to remain more closely aligned to? Basically their kin in Scotland or people in England who have shown time and time again they hold little regard for their views and traditions, despite their loyalty back to them. So I think that's one of the things that I thought that Brexit had thrown up. It wasn't previously discussed in other referendums in relation to Scottish independence.
Sure. And of course, one of the ironies is that the Scotland which exists today probably couldn't be more out of step with the viewpoints and worldviews of the DUP, for example, than it's possible to be. Scotland is effectively a left-wing social liberal country, which is very pro-European, very outward-looking, very a lot of the things that the DUP just aren't. So I think there's also a funny dynamic at work in terms of maybe the historical allegiance which some Northern Irish unionists might feel in relation to Scotland isn't necessarily reflected in the modern Scottish politics of modern Scotland. But
can you explain? I know you've been off for a few days, but hopefully you've caught up. Lord Frost, we know, has been engaging in a series of meetings, especially, controversially, meeting people like the Loyalist Communities Council, meeting various different unionist groups. I know that, especially even during that sort of DUP leadership debacle that went on, there were a lot of promises being made. There were a lot of briefings going on. Journalists were being told the changes to the protocol were going to be made regardless, and that this is what was going to happen. Explain that those proposals that have came forward now, what exactly they mean, and is it likely that Boris Johnson will be able to get the EU to agree to the proposed changes to the protocol?
Sure. So on Monday, it was a few days before that, wasn't actually, but the 21st, I think it was the 21st of July, they published this paper on a way forward for the Northern Irish Protocol, where the UK government basically said, we want to rewrite large parts of the protocol. And in effect, we want to have a system whereby, a bit like we mentioned before, you basically trust us to play by the rules, and you trust that our standards are good enough for your standards, and we can do away with lots of the bits of the protocol, but still have open borders everywhere. It's a completely unrealistic set of proposals for two main reasons. First of all, the UK government focuses very much on sort of voluntary compliance by businesses, by traders, by organizations with the right rules. If you're only selling in Northern Ireland, then you play by the UK rules. If you're going to sell into the Republic or into the EU, then you play by the EU rules. But effectively, it's a sort of, people have said it's a sort of honesty box approach to compliance with regulation. I mean, from a lawyer's point of view, that is so idiotic as to be almost incomprehensible. Because otherwise, why would we need laws or police or enforcement at all if everyone just did what they're told? The problem for law is not the people who obey the law. The problem is the people who ignore the law. And that's why you have systems to try and ensure compliance and enforcement. And the UK's approach is basically one which says, we're going to pretend that everyone is a law-abiding citizen. Well, actually, not everyone is a law-abiding citizen. The second problem, of course, is that the UK is basically saying, trust us. We'll do the enforcement. We'll look after everything. It's your border. We're leaving it wide open. In theory, anything from the world could flood into the single market, but we'll protect it for you. Now, the problem is, why should the EU trust the UK government to do that under the best of times, And here we're coming back to this idea of mutual recognition and the idea that you have borders for a reason and you police those borders for a reason. But also, why would this particular UK government be trusted by the EU when it has done nothing but misrepresent, distort, shirk its responsibilities, try to legislate in breach of the agreement, actually breach the agreement? The UK government, again, is trying to have its cake and eat it. It's trying to say, oh, trust us, but we're going to behave however we like in the most untrustworthy manner, but we still want you to trust us. And if you don't trust us, it's all your fault. You're being totally unreasonable and inflexible and disproportionate. You can see why the EU's answer was a pretty clear and very rapid no. We are not going to renegotiate the protocol. We're willing to look at ways to make the protocol work better. And indeed, the EU has put forward a set of proposals to try and ease some of the problems which have arisen under the protocol. But basically, the EU's position is, you proposed this, you signed it, you approved it, now you've got to keep your word. Because that's the fundamental basis upon which international relations are built. If you sign a treaty, you respect it. And you can't suddenly decide that you don't want that treaty anymore and you're going to try and rewrite it when you haven't even bothered trying to implement it properly in the first place. So I think the EU's answer has already been pretty clear. There won't be a renegotiation.
And that is, I'm assuming what you've just said is the reason why we're now hearing that Britain also they no longer want to abide or be part of the European Court of Justice, because they don't want to have any enforcement or any comeback should they just say that border. I think we got an insight this week. We know Dominic Cummings has went completely off message and is using his Twitter account to great effect to try and damage Boris Johnson. But I think reading between his very late night tweets, what he was saying is that his, proposal was, it's not our border, it's yours. We don't care what happens to it. Deal with it yourself. If you want checks, put them on the Irish side of it. And that seems to be almost, as you're saying, what Boris Johnson is now only trying to do it in a slightly more slicker or diplomatic way, saying is that we don't need to check anything. And if you need to check anything, check it over there. We're not doing it for you.
Yeah. And this in a way, this is the Achilles heel, of course, of the position of both Ireland and the EU as a whole. Because effectively, the UK just could put its hands back and say, well, we don't care what stuff of yours comes into our territory, because frankly, we're going to be deregulating anyway. We don't care what stuff of yours comes into our territory, but you do care about protecting your territory. So the onus is on you to protect your border. And of course, that does put an enormous amount of pressure on Ireland and the EU to do something about the border with Northern Ireland. And that is, in a way, the EU's Achilles heel. The EU's other Achilles heel, of course, is that it is, on the whole, quite an honourable organisation. It does tend to keep its word. It does tend to sort of invest in treaties and then try to make them work in good faith. And when you're dealing with a government like the Boris Johnson government, that is actually, although it might be a very admirable character in all sorts of other ways, it does become an Achilles heel for an untrustworthy and dishonourable government to try to exploit. So there's no doubt here that there's a bit of an imbalance between the EU and the UK position. But of course, the UK's Achilles heel is that if the UK really wants to behave like a rogue state, if the UK really wants to start ripping up international treaties and ignoring its obligations, and quite frankly, if the UK really does want to throw Northern Ireland into absolute turmoil, there will be serious consequences for the UK as well, diplomatically and in terms of its international relations, not just with the EU, but with a whole range of other powers as well, such as the Americans. So the EU has an Achilles heel. It doesn't want a border across the island of Ireland, and yet it can't afford not to have one if the UK really pushes it. But the UK also has a big Achilles heel, and that it doesn't want to find itself being completely isolated and treated like a delinquent state.
I'm going to ask you to get your crystal ball on here. Theresa May, during her time as Home Secretary, she was obviously was a Remainer. She wanted to remain within the trade bloc, but she had argued that Britain should have a referendum and leave the European Court of Human Rights, mainly because at that stage she couldn't deport people that she wanted to deport to quite as quickly as she wanted to. Do you believe that in our future we are looking at Britain trying to get itself out of its obligations under the European Court of Human Rights? Is that possible to even happen with a second referendum? And I mean, I suppose, and this is me with my tinfoil hat on, if we look at what the Secretary of State is proposing in relation to legacy, the only way to possibly make that work without that being litigated from now till the end of days is to try and in some way untangle themselves from the European Court of Human Rights obligations. Is it possible for Britain to even do that?
I mean, it's perfectly possible for the UK to leave the Council of Europe, totally separate organisation from the EU, of course, and to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. It's also perfectly possible, of course, without actually leaving the Council of Europe and the European Court of Human Rights, for the UK to repeal the Human Rights Act and to simply no longer have a domestically enforceable version of the ECHR, or to completely change the domestic enforcement and have a different system of human rights enforcement, but still with the lingering possibility of cases in Strasbourg. I mean, to be frank, we should accept, that the European Convention on Human Rights is a very majestic human rights instrument in many respects, but it's also a deeply, deeply flawed one. It hasn't stopped Russia or Turkey descending into quasi-authoritarian state-sponsored torture and abductions. And the European Convention on Human Rights has enormous value, but it also has very serious limits. It is possible to stay an adherent to the ECHR and carry out all sorts of human rights abuses and violations and basically get away with it, because the enforcement mechanisms of the ECHR are not necessarily that strong. At the moment, as far as I understand it, the UK is not proposing to leave the ECHR or to repeal the Human Rights Act. But of course, that option remains open at any time in the future. And it's a very
conversation about a Bill of Rights instead comes up every now and then. We hear this conversation that we'd be better with our own Bill of Rights. And I mean, when you look at some of the proposals that Priti Patel has put forward in relation to migration, you can see why that would be an attractive prospect for Britain to be able to rewrite that rather than have to abide by international standards. I also think in relation to what they want to do here in the north of Ireland, to draw a line under the sand under their previous, conduct in this part of the island, well, wouldn't that be the easiest way to try and push that through?
I mean, but like they can do both, of course. They can have their Bill of Rights, which doesn't necessarily comply with the ECHR and does actually allow them to commit various human rights violations domestically, while still remaining a member of the ECHR internationally, and just accepting that there will be cases that they lose at Strasbourg. But we've already seen that. If you think of something like prisoners' voting rights, the UK has been condemned by the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg for not at least considering whether to give certain prisoners voting rights. And the UK has consistently maintained the position that it's simply going to ignore the court in Strasbourg, and it will not even properly debate having an alternative system of prisoners' voting rights. So it is perfectly possible to have a domestic system that breaches fundamental rights while remaining part of the ECHR and still having the possibility of the international responsibility in Strasbourg. And in effect, what a British Bill of Rights would be is a sort of systematic version of that. We're going to keep certain human rights, but we're going to tinker with others to make sure that we can create violations as they would be seen in Strasbourg. And we'll still carry on having court cases at the European Court of Human Rights, but we'll just ignore it and we'll just carry on doing as we please. So in a way, the British Bill of Rights debate is more just a systematization of some of the violations that we already see in the UK's human rights regime already.
We're coming to the end of our time, but just before we finish, I'm going to put you on the spot and say in 5 years' time, what I'm going to do? Like people predict the winners of races and they put them in an envelope. I'm going to keep this somewhere, and in 5 years' time, whip it out and go, Michael Dougan, you said this is what happened. How do you foresee this playing out? Do you see this playing out in Scottish independence? Do you see it as Boris Johnson's term as premiership coming to an abrupt end at some stage, and maybe us having a rewind on what has happened? And do you see that the prospect of the EU allowing Britain to overrule the protocol and come up with a different version of events? What do you see as happening in 5 years' time?
Lots of variables to play with, aren't there? And I'm going to give a very lawyerly answer and just focus on the variables rather than give a clear response. I think in 5 years' time we could be looking at a very different situation. But maybe one of the lessons that we need to learn is about planning properly for major events. If there's one lesson we can all learn from Brexit, the lesson is don't take decisions that are going to muck up an entire country without properly thinking it through and planning for it. So I think what I would probably encourage people to do in Ireland, north and south, is to start thinking about properly, and not just as an aspiration or as a nice idea, but to actually start properly thinking and planning and discussing and debating what a unified Ireland might look like. What would be the constitutional arrangements? What would be the welfare system? What would be the education system? How could unionism be accommodated happily and enthusiastically even in a very different type of Irish state? Equally, if I were in Scotland, I would be saying to the Scottish government, what are you going to do about Schengen? What would you do about the single currency? How would you plan to manage the customs border with England? It's all very well to want an independent Scotland on an emotional level, on an identity level, but there are lots of difficult practical questions that have to be worked out as well, and they require careful planning and thinking through to make sure they work right. So in some respects, I suppose my answer is there are different permutations which might arise here, and we need to start thinking about them and planning for them. They might never happen, and it might all turn out to be a waste of time. But if they do happen, you don't want to find yourself in a situation where you're chaotically trying to come up and improvise answers and maybe getting it all wrong. But equally, on the other side of the equation, the bit that I'm really interested in, what will the EU look like in 5 years' time? We know that the EU never stands still. The EU is constantly evolving and adapting. Its whole job is to respond to problems and crises and to find ways of dealing with them, and to help its member states get through the tumult of the world. And so one of the big questions that we tend to forget about, because we're so focused on what's happening in Belfast or Edinburgh or London, the other big question we've got to think about is, well, what's happening with the EU? How is COVID? How are the various reforms of the EU actually changing the nature of Europe, which will also naturally, of course, change the position of the Republic. as well as a full member state of the EU. So I think we've also got to keep our eye very carefully on what happens in Germany and France, what happens with the Eastern European states, the problems in Poland and Hungary. Might we actually see some sort of, departure of a couple of other member states? But to be frank, probably for the best, because they're slipping into right-wing authoritarianism in a way which makes the rest of us feel quite uncomfortable. What's happening with the EU as well? And how does that fit into the equation of the border in Ireland, of Scottish independence, of what happens with the next UK administration? And of course, that's the final big variable that we need to prepare for. One day, hopefully, thankfully, Boris Johnson will just be a bad memory. He will leave a terrible legacy, but he'll just be a bad memory. Let's hope that the next UK administration actually plans for a more positive and constructive relationship between the EU and the UK, because in a lot of respects, the problems currently facing Northern Ireland are the direct consequence of an ideological, nationalistic administration in London. A lot of these problems could have been completely avoided or at least massively downgraded if we had a different government in London. Hopefully, in 5 years' time, we will have a different government in London, and that might well turn out to make the whole system much more workable, much less potentially explosive than it currently feels at the moment.
Michael, that was great. Thank you very much. I hope everyone who is listening feels better informed. I know I certainly do. Michael has predicted that Boris Johnson will be playing golf with Donald Trump on a golf course in 5 years' time, and the world will be a better place. We'll see if that comes to pass. And thank you very much for listening to this Féile on Phobail event.